I'm sure I speak for just about everybody in this room when I say, Lonnie, we'll see you in 18 months. So after Dr. Price received and read out to us Dr. Bunch's reply email that day many months ago, we set about the task of filling our lineup of speakers. And again, it came together within minutes. Let's make sure we make this about art museums too, Dr. Price said. Thelma Golden. And in addition to museums, let's think about historic sites. Let's get the people from Drayton Hall Historic Site in Charleston, South Carolina, where Clem often said they got it right. And then he said, not a lot of people know that the National Park Service, which maybe we're more used to thinking about as sort of sublime natural areas, think Yellowstone or Yosemite, that the NPS is a major, a crucial custodian of our national historic sites. So Dr. Price said, let's invite Robert Stanton, who conveniently enough served on the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation with him. And we are thrilled that he accepted. Mr. Stanton was the director of the National Park Service from 1997 to 2001, the culmination of a long career with NPS, which stretches back, as I understand it, to 1962, when he became a park ranger at Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming, after being recruited out of college by Stuart Udall, Jack Kennedy, President Kennedy's Secretary of the Interior. A native of Mosier Valley, Texas, a town settled in the 1870s by emancipated slaves, Mr. Stanton's career at the NPS has been marked by a deep commitment to, again, getting it right by, among other things, promoting a greater diversity of NPS workers and projects. The title of his talk today is Toward the Healing of a Nation, Historic Preservation in the National Parks. Please welcome Robert Stanton.
Good morning. To Madam Chancellor, to Ms. Price, the Price family, distinguished guests, ladies and friends, gentlemen, and my warmest welcome, my warmest greeting are to the students who honor us on this occasion. Join me in applauding the students who are with us on this occasion. I want to thank you, Mark, for that gracious introduction and for your and Clem's invitation for me to share in this very special occasion. And certainly to be with one of my heroes on this stage and at this podium, Dr. Lonnie Bunch. It's an added treat. This is my first visit to Rutgers, but its reputation is well known throughout this country. Its commitment to excellence has been so well represented by Dr. Clem Price in so many ways. As Mark mentioned, it was my great honor to have been appointed by President Obama in October to serve on the Advisory Council of Historic Preservation. But the added enjoyment was to join with the distinguished Vice Chair of that council, Professor Dr. Clem Price. He was personally appointed by the President to that position. But I want to share you here at Rutgers University, and certainly to the Price family, that Clem was a part of us. He will continue to be a part of us, and his legacy, I assure you, will endure in the National Council of Historic Preservation. And I bring to you that commitment on behalf of our leader, the chairman, Wayne Donaldson. Not too terribly long ago, I believe 2 years ago, I had the opportunity to serve as a co-panelist with Clem on a major session held in conjunction with the Congressional Black Caucus annual legislative weekend. And I'm reminded of something I experienced on that occasion that I'm experiencing on this occasion. I was asked to follow Clem on that program. And Mark, what have you done to me today? To follow the chancellor, the mayor, Mrs. Price, and then Lonnie Bunch. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been a lesson in humility. Mark, you and I need to talk. Because when Clem spoke to the august body there at the Congressional Black Caucus, they, as I, were held in awe. Because it was surely evident that he was filled with the spirit of Mr. Frederick Douglass. He was filled with the spirit of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. He was filled with the spirit of so many, and particularly the founder of African American History Month, starting in 1926 as Negro History Week. But he also exemplified his deep roots in the state of South Carolina, because he consistently demonstrated a thirst for education and an unwavering commitment to our young people in the tradition of Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune. That was Clem Price I knew. And of course, as I spoke earlier about Dr. Carter G. Woodson, Clem, under all circumstances, projected what was Dr. Woodson's mantra. If you don't tell them, they won't know. If you don't tell them, they won't know. History has to be shared to the broadest spectrum of the American people possible. Permit me, friends, at this time to share with you briefly my perspectives on the value and influences of our national historic sites, memorials, and monuments in our ongoing struggle, our ongoing journey in moving our nation, our communities towards we the people, a more perfect union, if you will. But allow me the opportunity to acknowledge the outstanding, critical, and important work of Dr. Price and this magnificent institute and this lecture series. It has been suggested, let gratitude be a part of your every thought and action. So I stand before you a grateful student of Dr. Clement Price, because above all, he was a teacher. He was a teacher. But as you know, he also embodied, as I mentioned earlier, to continue the good work of Dr. Carter G. Woodson. And as we reflect on the founding of Negro History Week in 1926, knowing that Dr. Carter G. Woodson, by design, selected the second week in the month of February to encompass the birthdays of one of this nation's greatest sons, born into that peculiar institution on the eastern shore of Maryland, called slavery. Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey Douglas. And the other was the 16th president of these United States. So I think it's fitting that I offer as somewhat of a context the wisdom and the guidance that were offered by these two giants that perhaps had some influence on Dr. Carter G. Woodson to say that I must tell them, otherwise they would not know. So journey with me briefly to 1857. The wisdom and the guidance of Mr. Douglas. I quote, "Let me give you a word on the philosophy of reform. The whole history of the progress of the human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to our august claims have been born of earnest struggle. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, and it may be both. But it must be a struggle. It must be a struggle." 8 years forward, and within those 8 years, reflective of what Mr. Douglas was speaking about in terms of the struggle, this nation, this people, endured and suffered, perhaps if not the most defining period in our collective history, known as the U.S. Civil War. 35 days before General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox, a unit of the National Park System. 150 years ago this year. President Lincoln, in his second inaugural address, arguably the most eloquent, most succinctly of all presidential inaugural addresses, save, of course, President Obama. In 1865, 100 years ago from this date, President Lincoln, with malice towards none, with charity for all, with fairness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the wounds of the nation. The end of the Civil War. It is interesting to note as we talk about binding up the wounds, had not it been marvelous at the time that we as a nation adopted that document that served us from 1786 to today, that they had an idea that it was not perfect. And I think they knew it was not perfect. They had to know that it was not perfect. But it did something that was ingenious. Something perhaps speaks to the frailty of mankind. That sometimes we are not willing to take on a challenge. We'll leave it to future generations. So what happened is that you have Article 5, which states simply that through a process, this document can be amended. It could be amended. And I believe at the last count, trying to move us towards a more perfect union, that document has been amended, not 10 times, not 15 times, not 20 times, but I believe 27 times. And as a result, direct result of the struggle that Mr. Douglas spoke about, and that President Lincoln reflected upon, was over a short period of time amended. The 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. The 14th Amendment, among other provisions, provided equal protection under the law. And the 15th Amendment guaranteeing the right to vote. Sorry, ladies, but you were not included in that 15th Amendment. I mean, you still could not vote. Had not it been beautiful, had not those provisions been incorporated in 1786. Drawing briefly upon my experiences as the director of the National Park Service, and actually spending over 35 years with the Park Service, let me just share very briefly the scope of its responsibility, then speak very specifically about how the national parks, particularly its historical and cultural resources, can contribute towards our healing the wounds that we have in fact inflicted on ourselves. As Mark mentioned, when you think of the Park Service of the park, you often think about the large, vast areas such as Yellowstone or Yosemite Glacier, Shenandoah. 3/4 of the 406 areas administered by your National Park Service. 3/4, my friends, speak specifically to our development as a people and as a nation. Every state has a park unit. America, Samoa, Guam, Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, and Washington, D.C. And the act that created the National Park Service states very simply, it is to promote and regulate these areas and to preserve them in perpetuity for the enjoyment and the benefit of this and future generations, but also protect the wildlife and the historical resources therein. An awesome responsibility to preserve, but yet promote the utilization on the part of the American people and our international visitors. Parks spread over some 84 million acres of land. An awesome responsibility. And a part of its mandate in terms of enjoyment is to impart the significance of these areas, not only the biological species, but certainly the human-made artifacts, structures, and what have you, as well as historical events that may have occurred on these lands. Next year, the National Park Service will celebrate its 100th anniversary. And many of you are wondering, say, you know, I'm doing a little arithmetic here, Bob. I know a little bit about my history. I know that there was Yellowstone in 1872, but you said Park Service celebrated 100th anniversary, 1916. So what happened from 1872 up until August 25, 1916? The Secretary of the Interior had direct responsibility for some 30 parks that were created either by an act of Congress or by a presidential proclamation until such time the Park Service came on the scene. And I'll touch upon that just a wee bit later. But also next year, we will celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, created as a part of the Historic Preservation Act of 1916. We will, in Washington, D.C., and other places, on the occasion of the 50th anniversary, my friend, we will remember vividly, forcefully, Clement Price in that celebration. But briefly, in addition to managing those 406 units throughout the system, the Park Service has other responsibilities given to it by Congress, many of which bear directly upon preserving resources within the state of New Jersey, the National Register of Historic Places, the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. And I'm pleased to inform you, as many of you know, that New Jersey participates directly in those programs. And I commend you individually and collectively on preserving our collective heritage as represented throughout this state. But let me offer you a couple of perspectives in terms of bridging the relationship between these cultural and iconic historic resources with the people. The important business of cultural resource preservation is preserving real historic places in real time for this and future generations. That experience and thousands other like it, different scale of purpose, are the true value of historic preservation. They transform past into present and present into future, giving context to ideas and anchorage to experience. In a real sense, my friends, the preservation of historic places is more than the protection of buildings, artifacts, structures, and landscape. Preservation demonstrates the value of diversity and community, and honors and links us with the heritage of our predecessors, and most importantly, represent our individual and collective legacy to our successors. One of the greatest accomplishments as a nation, it seems to me, is that we have come to recognize that our legacy is about learning and teaching, helping our youth find a better life and a better place because we have been here. We have made a contribution. But that also makes it necessary that we preserve the sites of tragic and difficult periods in our collective history, as well as those of our accomplishments. As the late outstanding historian whom I had the opportunity to get on my knees and beg and ask that he serve as the chairman of the National Park System Advisory Board during my tenure as a director, his response was, "Bob, I'll give you a year," and he did. And I speak of Dr. John Hope Franklin. Dr. John Hope Franklin, in addressing a major conference which I held in St. Louis, year 2000, he spoke about the values of historic places. He spoke about history. But John also said that those places that represent or commemorate difficult periods in our history, Manzanar, Battle of Little Bighorn, Gettysburg, Selma to Montgomery, Little Rock Central High School, are not places in which we are to allow ourselves to wallow in remorse, but rather, my friends, be moved to a high resolve to become better citizens. And when all is said and done, preservation, ultimate objective, is for those who experience them to come out of it a more enlightened and a better citizen. That is the bottom line. Certainly, the national parks and the historic sites they're in, it's often told that the image of sewing, a patchwork quilt in which each piece has a special story, but the full effect is only achieved when they are sewn together. Or in another version, a tapestry of interwoven strands of every hue and color, forming patterns of great beauty and special places for learning. I like this image, the image of the real America. The real America is a vast American civilization that constructed complex dwellings and developed the culture and built cities and villages and fought bravely to protect their own homelands, culture, and liberties. It is the historic home of educators, civil rights leaders, artists, political, conservation, and corporate leaders. It is the land of the poor struggling to build lives for themselves on a Kansas homestead claim. And it's my understanding in discussing Clem and his outside interests with Mrs. Price on last evening that one of his favorite places is the Nicodemus National Historic Site on the plains of Kansas. And I would have to tell you, my friends, our foreparents, they had courage, because if I were to get up one morning and look out over that plain, I would be out of there. But they made a home for themselves, and it is a rich story. It is a rich story. And that story will be preserved and interpreted in perpetuity as a unit of the National Park System. And certainly we have monuments memorials that honor those who, in the words of President Lincoln, gave their full measure of devotion to God and to country. It is places where we honor and preserve the rich cultural resources and tradition of American Indians and the native people of Hawaii, Alaska, and American Samoa. Within the National Park System are battle sites from the Revolutionary and the Civil War, including the key surrender fields of both great conflicts, the War of 1812 and the Westward Movement. And yes, my friends, area that preserve and commemorate the rich and diverse African-American experience as represented in our National Park System. When I first donned the uniform of the National Park Service, through the courageous leadership of then Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Lee Udall, before the Civil Rights Act of '64. There had been only 3 congressional pieces of legislation enacted by Congress to preserve in perpetuity in the national parks the life and legacy of 3 outstanding African Americans. Booker T. Washington National Monument in Virginia, George Washington Carver National Monument in Missouri. And Congress authorized the National Council of Negro Women 5 years after her death to construct on lands in the nation's capital, administered by the Park Service, a memorial, again, to one of America's greatest daughters, Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune. But what has kept me encouraged is that as a nation we're becoming more aware, and I trust more appreciative of the contributions that African Americans have made and continue to make to the growth of this country and our efforts to move towards a more perfect union. And let me just share with you very briefly the areas that now are under the care of the National Park Service. And unless Congress enact legislation revoking the initial legislation, or unless the President of the United States or his successor, his or her successor, thought I just dropped that in, revoke a prior presidential proclamation. These areas will stand as a testament to the richness of the Afro-American experience, not only for the month of February, but year-round, 365 days a year. And you were to go there, you'd be welcomed by the staff, and they will tell you about the richness of the story or the event occurred there. The Carter G. Woodson Home Historic Site, the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Site, the Martin Luther King Memorial, which President Obama dedicated on the National Mall in 2011. I encourage you to go there to see this magnificent memorial in the heart of the monumental core, within brief walking distance to the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial, and the Thomas Jefferson Memorial. The Charles Young Buffalo Soldier National Monument, the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Monument, the African Burial Ground National Monument, Boston African American National Historic Site, Brown versus Board of Education National Historic Site, Topeka, Kansas. And certainly we recall that decision by the Supreme Court that stated simply, we find unanimously that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Drawn out of the Plessis versus Ferguson decision by the Supreme Court in 1896. All of my childhood, all of my young adulthood was under that doctrine, separate but equal. I was 24 years of age before I could enter the front door of a cafe to order a cup of coffee where my mother served as a short order cook. Why did it take us so long? The struggle, Mr. Douglas, would remind us, it has to continue. It has to continue. And one would have thought that here's the Supreme Court, the highest court on the land, handed down the decision that under our Constitution it has no place. But we did not have the will to accept it. So we have Little Rock Central High School, National Historic Site, in which President Eisenhower had to assign troops to protect 9 of my peers to integrate the school of their choice. The struggle has to come with a will to live up to the letter and the spirit of our Constitution and the Supreme Court decisions. We have the New Orleans Jazz National Historic Park. We have the Nicodemus National Historic Park. Selma to Montgomery National Historic Site. And I look forward to seeing many of you in Selma first week in March as we join with the pioneers to celebrate the 50th anniversary of that march that led to Congress enacting legislation 50 years ago to try to give substance and support to the 15th Amendment. Again, why did it take us so long? Why did it take us so long? We have the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site. We have the Tuskegee Institute National Historic Site. We have the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, to talk about that chapter in our history where there was a continuing thirst to move towards an area of freedom. And certainly under the act that said that if you owned me, quote unquote, you could go into New York or New Jersey, anywhere. I had to go to Canada, to Mexico, to the Caribbean on the Underground Railroad to seek freedom. We have the memorial to the over 200,000 African Americans who fought with the Union forces in the Civil War. We have Port Chicago Navy Magazine National Historic Site. I didn't read about that when I was in school. I would encourage each of you to read about that incident that occurred in 1944 that ultimately propelled President Truman to issue a presidential executive order in 1948, integrating the armed forces of the United States. Think about it. Not until 1948 that a nation would fight its wars in an integrated fashion. Fort Monroe National Monument, the Gullah Geechee Heritage Quarter, and most recently, last Thursday, I believe, President Obama, exercising his authority under the 1906 Antiquity Act, designated the Pullman Porter's National Historic District as a unit of the National Park System to talk about the earlier efforts to seek justice and equal opportunity in the workplace, to organize or to unionize a rich story of our foreparents. The Mary McLeod Bethune Memorial, the Mary McLeod Bethune Council House, the first headquarters of the National Council of Negro Women in 1935. And certainly, Mr. Frederick Douglass, And I often say, as I think I mentioned earlier, that Mr. Douglas and I met in the same year, met the Park Service in the same year, 1962. These are areas within the National Park System that preserve and commemorate 365 days a year, our rich African American experience. But one of things that has been revealed more than ever, as many of you well know, our foreparents were everywhere. So that literally there isn't a park that we did not make a contribution. And those stories are being told. Harpers Ferry Historical Park, there were 5 young African Americans who was with John Brown, the historically black college there in which Frederick Douglass was a member of the Board of Trustees, Story College. The Niagara Movement, W. D. Boyce and others met there. The first Niagara Movement held on the lands of the United States, the first one being in Canada, that gave rise to the founding of the NAACP. Those stories are now being told at Harpers Ferry. We tell the story of the African American who fought in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and all wars in this country. We talk about the Buffalo Soldiers protecting Sequoia National Park and Yosemite National Park before there was a National Park Service. We talk about the decision made by the courts at the federal courthouse in St. Louis, a part of the arch, the Dred Scott decision. We talk about women's rights at the Women's Right National Historic Park in Seneca Falls. And if you were to go there, there's a beautiful bronze statue depicting some of the leaders, including 2 African Americans, Sojourner Truth and Mr. Douglas. Mr. Douglas, if you were to look at the annals of history, particularly you ladies, he was always there for the ladies. Before anyone else, he was advocating that the women should have the right to vote before the populace picked up with that, a rich story. These examples represent the sweep of history embraced in your national parks, and we learn lessons best at places where they actually happen. A better place for learning could not have been more than in the National Park System and in that institutions that are under the leadership of Dr. Bunch and others in the museum profession. It is my hope that as we continue to mature as a people and as a nation, other areas will be added to the National Park System. Only through your continued interest and efforts will that take place. And what is encouraging, that new parks that have come into the areas, even though they may not specifically speak about African Americans as a primary theme, but particularly with respect to slavery, many areas were once plantations, and the story of African Americans as enslaved persons has to be interpreted and preserved at those sites. Of everything handed down to us as Americans, nothing is as important to pass on to our legacy and future generations than that same reputation for truth and reality. It is at the one most precious and the most fragile of the treasures in the hands of the National Park Service. And certainly in my relationship with Clement, he said ultimately that is the purpose of history and revealing it to the people. You are revealing the truth. And in understanding the truth and being able to confront it will contribute to our healing the wounds that have been inflicted. But parks must have a continuing relevancy to any nation's most precious resource, its young people. And we must recognize that education is the prime mission of historic preservation. We must avail ourselves to programs and to other activities that will connect our youth, all of our youth, with the richness of their heritage. It's not only preserved in the national park system, but throughout other organizations in our country. Certainly in terms of today's technology, many that I have no grasp for, the young people do, we have to utilize, again, to reach out to our young people. What we are all about, my friends, we are now a nation of over 300 million citizens. Perhaps one of the most diverse countries on this fragile place that we call Earth. It is important that there be some commonality to our understanding and embracement of the trials and tribulations as well as successes that have brought us to this stage. It is the mission of the Park Service, the National Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and the Smithsonian and other institutions to bridge their relationship so future generations will continue to stay in the struggle for freedom, liberty, and dignity for all. In honor and in memory of Clement Price and other giants that have gone before, we cannot do less. So I wanted to salute you in the memory of Clement. I have searched long and hard to find an expression that captures what we talk about today as diversity and inclusion. I've searched the library, gone to the internet, conferred with individuals, but I have not found any expression that sums it up better than Mr. Douglas. Let me share with you some sentiments of Mr. Douglas over 100 years ago, when the term diversity and inclusion were not a part of the problems. But I think Mr. Douglas knew that there would come one day a Clement Price, because the embodiment of these words represent Clement. And in closing, I salute you in the words of Mr. Douglas. Our best and most valued acquisitions have been obtained either from our contemporaries or from those who have preceded us in the field of thought and discovery. We have reaped where others have sown, and that which others have sown, we have gathered. It must in truth be said that no possible native force of character and no depth of wealth or originality can lift a man into absolute independence of his fellow man. And no generation of men can be independent of the preceding generation. I believe in individuality, but individuals are to the mass like waves to the ocean. The highest order of genius is as dependent as is the lowest. It is like the lofty waves of the sea, derives its power and greatness from the grandeur and vastness of the ocean of which it forms a part. We differ as the waves, but are as one as the sea. That's Clement Price. Ladies and gentlemen, we are one as the sea. Thank you. At this time, with your indulgence, have a very brief video to show you that depicts some of the area. Thank you again for this great opportunity.
Hello, I'm Daphne Maxwell Reid. I'm here visiting the Maggie Walker National Historic Site in Richmond, Virginia, and I invite you to join me as we explore this and other important sites in African American history that are being preserved for our future generations.
Our national parks connect us to our origins and our destiny as American people. We treasure them because they educate us, inspire us, and enrich our lives. The African American Experience Fund works to build awareness and funding for programs in special national parks and historic sites that preserve and celebrate the cultural heritage of African Americans. It is part of the National Park Foundation, the official nonprofit partner of America's national parks.
African American history is commemorated in many of the almost 400 National Park Service areas in 49 states, Washington, D.C., the U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, American Samoa, and Guam. These are special places for learning, and they offer great lessons in courage, freedom, and justice. Because many Americans don't know about these historic treasures, we decided we should do something to reach out and share this rich history. Preserving this history requires not only visiting these areas with our children and friends, but also providing our support through volunteer service, financial contributions, and a wide range of partnerships in order to provide programs that are not covered by government funding.
Join us now on a journey to these special places. Discover how honor and courage are passed down through the ages. It's a journey you won't want to miss, and one you'll want to share.
Begin at the sacred burial ground of African slaves in Lower Manhattan that documents their role in building the financial capital of the world. Walk the historic trail of African American patriots in Boston. See the Abiel Smith School, the first public school for African American children in the United States. Visit the memorial to the famed 54th Massachusetts Infantry, the African American regiment that fought so bravely for the cause of freedom in the Civil War. In Natchez, Mississippi, learn of the business expertise of William Johnson, a freed slave and respected entrepreneur who captured the day-to-day life of the antebellum South in a 2,000-page diary. In Louisiana, stop for a day at Cane River and discover lands where mechanical and agricultural genius flourished, even in the bondage of slavery. Experience the work of volunteers in more than 26 states, Canada, the Caribbean, and Mexico, researching and documenting the journey of thousands of slaves bound for freedom at nearly 150 stops on the Underground Railroad. Or hear the sounds of the birth of jazz, the quintessential American music that arose in New Orleans. And experience the joy of children learning the principles of music. In Washington, D.C., stroll through the stately homes of Frederick Douglass and Mary McLeod Bethune, restored to their original beauty, reflecting the pride and intellectual energy of these giants, internationally respected human rights activists and advisors to presidents. Witness the restoration of the home of Carter G. Woodson that will bring the father of Black history to life for thousands of schoolchildren. Just hours away by car, you can visit the home of Maggie Lena Walker, the first American woman to charter and serve as president of her own bank. Or the birthplace of Booker T. Washington, a working farm preserved as it was in his boyhood 150 years ago. In Ohio, the poetic genius of Paul Laurence Dunbar is on display in the place where he lived and worked. The town of Nicodemus, Kansas, is preserved and tells the story of a booming community of Black citizens who sought better lives out west. Visit Tuskegee Institute in Alabama and explore the Oaks, home to Booker T. Washington, founder of this world-class educational institution, where even the bricks were made by Tuskegee students. Years later, Tuskegee was the site where the first African-American military pilots were trained. Undeterred by prejudice and segregation at home, the trailblazing Tuskegee Airmen proved themselves in combat in Northern Africa and Europe during World War II, earning the respect of bomber crews who grew to depend on their skillful air coverage in battle. At Tuskegee, you will also learn of the extensive scientific achievements of George Washington Carver. And at his birthplace in Missouri, the first national monument dedicated to a scientist and an African American, you will be captivated by the wonders of nature that captured his imagination as a boy. The movement that changed America, and indeed the world, is chronicled in places like Brown v. Board of Education, Little Rock Central High School, the birthplace of Martin Luther King Jr., and the Selma to Montgomery National Historic Trail. These uniquely American stories, traditions, and landscapes bind the legacy of African Americans into the fabric of a great nation. The stories of these places inspire us to strive for our own strength, courage, and wisdom to honor the people and ideals they represent. What an extraordinary journey, and what an exciting challenge to preserve them for new generations of Americans. Through your support, the African American Experience Fund will be making a difference in the lives of children and communities around the country by funding projects that share the rich history of African Americans while also teaching the importance of preserving it. Programs like the restoration of Ebenezer Baptist Church on the campus of the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Site in Atlanta, or programs on the importance of Black journalism at the Maggie Walker National Historic Site in Richmond, Virginia. A map detailing the Underground Railroad at the Boston African American Historic Site engages visitors of all ages in this incredible effort of ordinary citizens committed to helping their fellow Americans reach freedom. Research, volunteer support, community engagement work, and distance learning programs ensure that our whole national story is protected and passed on faithfully, completely, and accurately.
And you can be part of it. Join us on this journey to our future that is possible only if we understand our past.
Support the African American Experience Fund. This presentation was funded by a generous donation from the Walt Disney Company.